The competence tax. The other half of the Ringelmann effect and why conscientious people burn out first. The revealing part of a meeting often comes after it ends. Everyone agrees or says they do. People stand up, the energy breaks, then one person stays behind for another 10 minutes and makes the work real. They send the note nobody formally owned, fix the sentence that would otherwise be misread, attach the file that was mentioned 3 times and still not attached. The meeting presents itself as collective effort. Completion is usually more personal than that. The Ringelmann effect is the old finding that as groups get larger, individual effort tends to fall. It's usually introduced as a story about loafing. People hide in the crowd. Responsibility diffuses. Fair enough, but that's only half the phenomenon. When effort diffuses in a group, the missing effort doesn't simply vanish. Very often it concentrates elsewhere. That's the part worth thinking about. In most teams, missing effort migrates toward the person least able to tolerate an avoidable failure. This is why conscientious people so often end up overextended, not because they're formally assigned more work, though sometimes they are, but because they absorb more ambiguity. And ambiguity is where a surprising amount of modern work actually lives. An unclear brief is work waiting to happen. A vague promise made in a meeting is work waiting to happen. A delicate client relationship nobody has really taken charge of is work waiting to happen. The same goes for a decision that everyone assumes someone else will make, or a deadline that exists socially before it exists operationally. Much of what exhausts competent people isn't the visible task list. It's the unclaimed residue around the task list. That residue has to go somewhere. The conscientious are vulnerable because they experience that residue differently. A loose end doesn't register as mild disorder, it registers as a claim on attention. A missing follow-up isn't just something that would be nice to resolve, it becomes difficult to leave unresolved. This is what many people miss about conscientiousness. It's not merely diligence, it's a low tolerance for unfinishedness. From the inside, stepping in feels like fidelity to a standard. From the outside, it becomes a free resource. Those are the same event viewed from 2 levels. At the personal level, the conscientious person thinks, this shouldn't be allowed to go wrong for such a stupid reason. At the group level, the system learns that certain kinds of vagueness will be metabolized by a particular person. Once that learning happens, standards start migrating out of process and into personality. The team doesn't need to become clearer because someone inside it is reliably clearer than the team. This is why praise can be misleading. When an organization says someone is indispensable, that can mean one of 2 things. Either the person is genuinely exceptional in a healthy system, or the system has discovered a cheap way to avoid improving itself. In practice, it's often the second. A weak handoff, a fuzzy role boundary, a manager who avoids crisp decisions, an overcommitted team that keeps promising more than it can structure properly. All of these can appear workable for much longer than they really are if one careful person keeps converting disorder into output. The more reliable you are, the less feedback the system receives about its own design failures. That's the real competence tax. It isn't just that capable people do more, it's that their competence conceals the amount of dysfunction around them. They make the team look more coordinated than it is, the timeline more realistic than it is, the manager more competent than he is, the culture more responsible than it is. Their private standards subsidize the public appearance of order. This creates a nasty psychological trap. If the conscientious person stops stepping in, standards drop, things are missed, clients notice, colleagues get exposed, the person feels complicit in a decline they can already see coming. If they do step in, the immediate problem is solved, but the system learns again that it can outsource clarity to their conscience. Either way, they lose. They're caught between an internal standard and an external structure that increasingly depends on it. That's why so many competent people look calm while living with a low-grade sense of pursuit. They aren't simply busy, they're surrounded by small pockets of unowned responsibility, each one emitting a faint signal that they find harder to ignore than other people do. Over time, this changes how they move through the world. They start scanning by default. They anticipate failure before it happens. They read the room for what hasn't been said. They listen for the promise inside the vague statement. They become good at compensation, which makes them even easier to depend on. Then usefulness hardens into identity. This is where the problem gets moral as much as organizational. Reliable people often derive self-respect from being the one who can be counted on. That isn't vanity. It's usually bound up with sincere values. Care, precision, dislike of waste, dislike of embarrassment, a wish not to let others suffer for preventable mistakes. But once usefulness fuses with self-concept, boundaries start to feel dishonorable. Saying this isn't mine feels petty. Letting someone else experience the consequence of their own vagueness feels cruel. So the person continues to intervene, and every intervention confirms the system's quiet expectation that they will. A lot of modern burnout isn't overwork in the simple sense, it's moral overextension. It comes from repeatedly treating every visible gap as if it were yours to close. This isn't confined to work. The same pattern shows up in families, friendships, and communities. One person remembers birthdays, notices tensions early, keeps track of what was promised, smooths the logistics, absorbs the social awkwardness, and notices what would otherwise go unsaid. That person is often described as generous, mature, or emotionally intelligent. They may be all three, but there's still a structural question underneath the praise. Why has one person's conscience become everyone else's backup system? Once you see the pattern, a lot of common advice starts to look shallow. Care less isn't serious advice for people whose value lies partly in caring, nor is it even desirable. The world does in fact depend on those who notice what others miss. The better move is sharper discrimination. Not every gap is yours. Not every standard requires private enforcement. Not every failure should be quietly prevented. The key distinction is between caring about an outcome and owning the machinery required to produce it. Competent people often collapse those two. They see a standard and assume custody, but care isn't ownership. You can care deeply that a thing be done well without agreeing to become the place where all unresolved parts of it accumulate. That distinction has practical consequences. It means naming ownership early, before social convenience has a chance to blur it. It means asking who is actually responsible, what done specifically means, and what happens if it isn't done. It means noticing when you're being handed not a task but an atmosphere. It also means allowing some failures to become visible, not out of spite and not to teach anyone a theatrical lesson, but because hidden failure teaches the system nothing. If every dropped ball is caught by the same person, the group never learns how often it's dropping them. Good leaders understand this instinctively. They don't treat repeated heroics as a sign of health. They treat them as diagnostic data. If the same people are always rescuing the same classes of problem, there is almost certainly a design flaw somewhere upstream. The job isn't to thank them more eloquently. The job is to stop using character as a substitute for structure. The usual reading of the Ringelmann effect is that groups make individuals lazy. The more interesting reading is that groups also teach conscientious people to live as spare capacity. One story is about reduced effort, the other is about concentrated burden. They're two sides of the same phenomenon. The missing effort in a group rarely disappears. It settles on whoever finds it hardest to watch things fall apart.